Judge insults Jasmine Crockett in court. Minutes later, she flips the entire courtroom and gets him arrested. The courtroom door creaked open with an eerie slowness, every eye turning in perfect, predatory synchronization. Jasmine Crockett stepped in, alone, steady, and unapologetically defiant. Yet the weight of the room hit her like a wall of ice. There was no welcome, no professional courtesy, not even a nod. Only silence and eyes. Dozens of them. Cold, dismissive, judgmental. As if she didn't belong. As if she were an intruder in a sacred space reserved for the powerful and corrupt. Her tailored suit, crisp case files, and quiet resolve could not shield her from the unspoken accusation lingering in the air. "You don't belong here." The room didn't need to say it aloud. Its silence screamed it. But Jasmine kept walking. At the center of it all sat Judge Howard Gates, his presence as imposing as it was venomous. A man both feared and revered, known for wielding his gavel like a blade. Quick, brutal, and merciless. He didn't rise. He didn't even acknowledge Jasmine's presence until she reached the prosecutor's table. Then slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowed with the gleam of condescension. The corners of his mouth twitched, not in welcome, but in disdain. He spoke without ceremony, his voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "I hope you're not here to perform, Ms. Crockett," he said, each word dipped in contempt. "We have no time for cheap political theater." His tone was not just dismissive, it was an insult, a deliberate public branding meant to humiliate her before she had said a single word. And it worked, at least for a moment. The courtroom remained dead silent, but not for long. From the defense table came a low, stifled chuckle, then another, quiet snickers like snakes hissing in the shadows. Jasmine heard them clearly, every smirk behind her back echoing louder than a gunshot. She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. But inside, a familiar ache returned, one she'd known too many times. The ache of walking into rooms where justice was a costume and prejudice was policy. She had come prepared with evidence, facts, and law. But in that moment, it was clear. This courtroom wasn't a battlefield. It was a rigged arena, and she was meant to be the entertainment before the slaughter. Still, she stood tall, refusing to give the wolves the satisfaction of seeing her bleed. Judge Gates watched her closely, as if measuring how long it would take to break her spirit. His fingers tapped the edge of the bench, a rhythmic taunt that filled the silence with foreboding. Jasmine placed her file gently on the table, but the sound it made when it landed was deafening in the quiet room. Every move she made, every breath she took, was scrutinized, dissected, mocked. "Let's be clear," Gates continued, voice rising just enough to command the room without shouting. "If you're here to parade around with your progressive talking points, this court has little patience. We deal in reality, not rhetoric." His words weren't just cruel. They were loaded, crafted to undermine her credibility, her experience, even her intelligence. Not a judge dispensing justice, but a man guarding his domain with venom and ego. Jasmine's jaw tightened. She didn't respond immediately. She knew better than to play into his game. The weight of history pressed on her chest. Years of watching women like her be silenced, dismissed, erased. But this time was different. This time, she had walked straight into the lion's den, not as prey, but as a spark they hoped to snuff out before it turned to fire. Around her, the gallery remained still, except for those subtle shifts, those whispered murmurs that always follow public humiliation. But Jasmine didn't blink. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, steady, and sharp as glass. "Your Honor, I'm here to present facts. Nothing more, nothing less." It wasn't defiance, it was clarity, the kind that cut deeper than shouting ever could. But Gates was unmoved. "Facts?" he sneered, leaning back with a theatrical roll of his eyes. "I've seen more compelling arguments from first-year interns." Again, the defense table chuckled. Again, the room dipped into a silence soaked with tension. Jasmine knew what this was. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a performance, a calculated attempt to discredit her in the eyes of the court, the jury, the press. She looked around, at the cameras, the notepads, the faces half hidden behind screens. She could feel the narrative being written without her. Young black attorney tries to take on the system, fails spectacularly. That was the story they wanted. That was the ending they had already prepared. But Jasmine had walked into this room knowing it wouldn't be fair. She hadn't expected applause or courtesy. She had expected fire. And fire she could handle. She let the insults land, let the laughter swell, let the judge gloat, because behind her silence was a storm waiting to rise. Jasmine Crockett stood with quiet defiance, a single folder gripped tightly in her hand. Exhibit A, her first strike in a case built on weeks of sleepless nights and painstaking investigation. The pages within detailed a complex web of financial deceit, inflated project budgets, falsified invoices, and reallocated state funds that vanished into the pockets of the rich and powerful. She stepped forward and placed the file on the evidence table, her voice steady as she spoke. Your Honor, this document outlines unauthorized financial transfers tied directly to the Lawson development contracts. These discrepancies are not clerical errors. They are deliberate theft of taxpayer money. She turned slightly to face the courtroom, projecting both confidence and clarity. But before the evidence could even be reviewed, before a single line was considered, Judge Howard Gates leaned back in his chair and let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. Ms. Crockett, he sneered, are you planning to bury this courtroom in garbage? Because that's what this looks like, rubbish. Pages and pages of noise, and not a single fact worth our time. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, as if the oxygen had been ripped from the room. She opened her mouth to respond, but Gates was already talking over her. His voice rose not with passion, but with precision, slicing through her argument before it even began. We don't have time to indulge in fantasy spreadsheets and desperate conjecture, he declared, waving his hand dismissively over the folder as if it were filth. You bring in stacks of paperwork as if volume equals credibility, but this court deals in substance, not theatrics. Jasmine tried again, her voice firmer now. These aren't conjectures, Your Honor. They are verified transactions, cross-referenced with city planning budgets and state audit logs. She flipped open the first page, her hands steady, but Gates didn't look. Objection sustained, he barked, though no objection had been made. This entire line of evidence is inadmissible on the grounds of irrelevance. The defense attorney smirked from his seat. The court reporter blinked rapidly, unsure whether to type or wait for order. Around them, the gallery remained silent, but not because they didn't care. They were watching a demolition in real time. Jasmine felt the heat rise behind her eyes, but she refused to let it show. She had faced worse, been underestimated, overruled, and overlooked, but never like this. This wasn't a challenge of law. This was an execution of her voice. With respect, Your Honor, she said, forcing each word through clenched teeth. I haven't been allowed to present a single sentence from the document. Gates smiled, a thin, cruel thing. And yet, I've already heard enough, he said flatly. I don't need to waste this court's time with the fantasies of a lawyer who clearly thinks courtroom drama is the same thing as legal merit. The words stung not because they were true, but because they were so clearly crafted to humiliate. Jasmine wasn't being critiqued. She was being crushed. Not because her evidence lacked strength, but because her presence challenged the unspoken order of power that ruled that room. Around her, everything felt calculated. The snide looks from the defense team, the performative exhaustion on the judge's face. Even the silence from the gallery reeked of quiet approval. It was as if the entire room had rehearsed this moment, one where the outsider, the idealist, the woman who dared to believe in justice, would be publicly shamed for her audacity. Jasmine stood her ground, her breathing slow and measured, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her waver. This isn't about theatrics, she said, louder now, pushing her voice through the fog of contempt. This is about financial misconduct of the highest order. Money meant for schools, hospitals, and roads, stolen and laundered through shell contracts. I have proof. She held up the next page, one containing the payment ledger signed by both Lawson and a city treasurer. But again, Gates struck down with his gavel, louder this time, drowning her out. This isn't a conspiracy theory conference, Ms. Crockett, he snapped. You're not going to stand in my courtroom and turn it into a stage for your personal crusade? The words hit like bullets, each one designed to belittle, discredit, and destroy. Jasmine's heart pounded, not from fear, but from fury. She had come prepared to argue law, but now she was fighting for the right to be heard. She looked around the room and realized she wasn't just against one man. She was against a machine that didn't fear facts but feared exposure. She gathered her papers slowly, methodically, refusing to back away like a defeated fighter. If seeking truth is a crusade, then yes, I will carry that banner, she said under her breath, eyes locked on the judge. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just hostile, it was her battlefield, and she wasn't retreating. The tension in the courtroom had already reached a boiling point, but Judge Gates wasn't finished. He leaned forward on the bench, his fingers steepled, voice lowered just enough to make the venom feel more personal. You know, Ms. Crockett, he began, the words oozing with performative civility. People like you often walk into these halls with a chip on your shoulder, hoping to rewrite history with idealism and half-baked legal theories. The room went still, not out of shock, but out of anticipation. They'd seen this before. This wasn't a critique of her case anymore. It was a character assassination. You come here waving around documents and pretending you're a savior, but you forget where you come from. Don't let your background mislead you into thinking that passion substitutes for professionalism. His eyes narrowed, cold and exacting. Frankly, I'm tired of courtroom crusaders who think their skin color entitles them to moral authority. The words hung in the air like poison. Jasmine didn't move. She couldn't. Her body had stiffened, locked between fury and restraint. Her right hand gripped the edge of the prosecution table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Beneath the surface, her blood boiled, her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Yet her face remained unreadable, jaw clenched, lips sealed, eyes forward. But inside it was chaos. A hurricane of humiliation, rage, and disbelief churned just beneath the surface. She could feel the stares pressing in, like invisible hands judging her reaction more than the words spoken. She blinked once, slowly, and in that moment her eyes shimmered, not from defeat but from restraint, because crying here would be surrender, and she had come too far, survived too much to give them that victory. She opened her mouth, prepared to speak, to reclaim her space, her dignity, but Gates cut her off again, this time louder, sharper, and laced with open mockery. Where did you even study law, Ms. Crockett? He sneered. YouTube University? Or was it some activist boot camp that hands out law degrees with protest signs? A ripple of laughter came from the defense table, a cruel confirmation that the humiliation was working. Jasmine stood frozen, absorbing the blows in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood the trap. Every insult was bait. Every interruption was designed to provoke. He wasn't just trying to dismiss her. He was trying to break her, publicly, piece by piece. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of justice. It felt like a stage for abuse. Every word from the bench dripped with arrogance, with the weight of unchecked power. Gates was no longer pretending to be impartial. He had made it personal. You know what I think? He continued, voice rising in false exasperation. I think you're here because someone thought putting a loud voice in a courtroom would make headlines. Not because you have a real case, not because you understand the law, but because you're useful for optics. Jasmine's spine straightened as the words cut deeper than any legal argument ever could. He wasn't just attacking her professionalism, he was attacking her existence, her identity, her right to even stand in that courtroom. She fought to steady her breathing, anchoring herself in the rhythm of it. Inhale, hold, exhale. Her fingers trembled slightly, betraying the calm on her face. Still, she refused to blink, refused to look down. Her gaze met his, direct, unwavering, defiant. Let him see that she wasn't afraid. Let him see that every time he tried to drag her down, he was only sharpening the steel inside her. She finally managed to speak, though her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I am here because the law demands accountability, not comfort. But Gates cut her off mid-sentence. slamming his gavel with theatrical force. "Don't lecture me," he snapped. "This is not your soapbox, and you are not some legal messiah." The words echoed off the wooden walls, sharp and brutal. Courtroom sat in stunned silence, not out of sympathy, but because they sensed they were witnessing a public execution disguised as a legal proceeding. Jasmine stood there, isolated and exposed, a single woman holding her ground while the weight of institutional bias pressed down on her from every direction. The injustice wasn't subtle, it was deliberate, calculated, and absolute. Still, she did not flinch. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett became more than a lawyer. She became a symbol of every person who had ever been silenced, belittled, or erased in rooms like this. Her silence was not weakness, it was power restrained. Her stillness was not defeat. It was the calm before the eruption. And while the court might have laughed with Gates today, she knew something they didn't. The truth was on her side. And when it finally broke through the cracks of this corrupted room, it would burn everything that tried to bury it. Jasmine stood motionless for a beat, the chaos in her chest eclipsed only by the chilling precision of what she was about to do. With a quiet exhale, she reached into her case and pulled out a single document. No fanfare, no preamble. The room was still reeling from Judge Gates' relentless attacks, but the tide was about to shift. She walked slowly toward the projector, her heels clicking like a countdown, and placed the paper under the lens. The screen behind her flickered to life, and with it, the air changed. There it was, a city planning contract, grossly inflated, signed and authorized not only by the lead developer, but also by Judge Howard Gates himself. A gasp cut through the courtroom like a blade. Time seemed to pause as eyes darted between the document and the man on the bench. For a single heartbeat, Gates was frozen, and his face, usually unreadable, flashed pale with recognition. The silence was no longer neutral, it had turned on him. But the moment didn't last. Like a cornered animal, Gates struck back with practiced venom. "That document is inadmissible," he spat, his voice louder than necessary, trembling at the edges. "It was obtained improperly, irrelevant, invalid, and unconstitutional." His words poured out in a flurry, designed not to argue but to erase. He didn't even bother examining the evidence. He didn't ask its source, its chain of custody, or its connection to the case. He simply condemned it, on sight, on instinct, because he knew what it was. It wasn't just paper, it was a mirror. One that showed his reflection with all the corruption and filth he had spent decades hiding behind a robe. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood tall, letting the silence linger, letting the weight of the revelation hang like storm clouds over the courtroom. She turned toward the bench, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "Your Honor," she said, the irony of the title thick in the air. "The contract was acquired legally through subpoena, verified by 2 independent agencies. The signature matches your own on record." Another ripple moved through the gallery, tension crackling like static electricity. Gates slammed his gavel, desperate to reclaim control. "I said it's inadmissible," he barked. "This ends now." But the command fell flat. The jury had seen it. The reporters had seen it. The bailiff had seen it. No matter how loudly he yelled, no matter how furiously he gestured, he could not unsee what had just been made visible. And more importantly, he could not make them forget it. Jasmine's eyes were locked on him, unwavering. "If the court is allowed to discard evidence without due review," she said, "then we're not conducting a trial. We're running a charade." Her words didn't rise in volume, but they carried weight, heavy and damning. Gates glared back at her, but his bluster was cracked now, the armor of arrogance showing fractures. He shuffled the papers on his desk, looking for an exit, for a legal technicality, for anything that could restore the illusion of control. But the courtroom was no longer his, not entirely. Whispers broke out among the jurors. Pens scratched frantically as journalists scribbled every word. The balance had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Still, Jasmine knew this wasn't victory. Not yet. She had seen power squirm before. It doesn't fall quietly. It claws, it bites, it drags everything down with it. "The public deserves transparency," she continued. walking back to the table with calm precision. And this courtroom, above all, deserves truth. Gates opened his mouth to respond but found no words that could mask his panic. His robe felt heavier now, the bench higher, colder, more isolated. He tried to sneer, but the mask of superiority no longer fit. For once, he was the one on trial, and Jasmine had made sure there was no place left to hide. Around them, the courtroom was no longer an audience. It was a jury. Every glance, every breath, every heartbeat aligned against the man who had ruled with impunity for too long. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, not broken, not silenced, but rising. She hadn't just presented a document. She had shattered a wall, one forged from fear, power, and unspoken rules. Now, with just a single piece of truth, the foundation was cracking, and the collapse was only beginning. And Jasmine wasn't finished, because what she revealed next would silence the entire courtroom and turn fear into fury. Jasmine Crockett didn't tremble. She didn't stall. While the courtroom buzzed with tension thick enough to drown in, she moved with the steadiness of a surgeon preparing for a final incision. Her hand reached into the briefcase with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing the truth is about to do what no argument, no plea, and no protocol ever could. Cut through corruption like fire through paper. Without a word, she placed a compact audio recorder on the evidence table, clicked the volume up, and pressed play. What followed wasn't static or courtroom chatter. It was a voice, low and familiar, stained with contempt and authority. Make sure that girl doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. Clean everything up. The words crawled through the speakers and exploded in the courtroom like a grenade. Gasps erupted. Pens fell from reporters' hands. Several jurors froze mid-blink, their faces draining of color. The gallery murmured with disbelief, the sound like the first gust of a coming storm. Judge Howard Gates didn't speak, not immediately. His mouth opened slightly, his jaw locking as though the words had knocked the breath from him. For a split second, just long enough for Jasmine to see it, he wasn't the untouchable figure robed in black. He was just a man, cornered, exposed, and terrified. But like a seasoned predator, Gates recovered quickly, or at least tried to. He straightened, forced a sneer, and barked, "This is a violation of privacy. That recording is inadmissible and illegally obtained." His voice boomed, but the echo that once commanded fear now rang hollow. There was no strength behind it, no shield left to hide behind. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She reached for another folder, this one marked with a red tab, and opened it with the same precision she used to dismantle lies. Inside was a printed transcript, line for line, word for word, matching the audio that had just sliced through the courtroom like a scalpel. She held it up high for the gallery to see and laid it on the projector. The text illuminated on the screen behind her, each damning sentence displayed like a scar carved into the very walls of the courthouse. This transcript, Jasmine said, her voice ringing clear, was authenticated by 2 independent forensic audio labs. It matches the wiretap approved by the State Ethics Bureau during their internal corruption probe. Her eyes locked onto Gates. "And your voice, Judge Gates, is unmistakable." A wave of murmurs swept through the room, stronger this time, no longer whispers but the sound of truth awakening. Gates leaned forward, his knuckles white against the wood of his bench. "This is outrageous. You've overstepped every boundary of this court," he thundered. But it was the rage of a man watching his empire crumble, not the certainty of a judge dispensing order. Jasmine didn't answer his outburst. She didn't have to. The evidence had spoken louder than anything she could say. Around her, the faces of the jury were no longer blank slates. They were filled with disbelief, with anger, with realization. They had watched her be disrespected, silenced, diminished. Now they were watching the veil drop, revealing the rot that had been hidden behind the robe. And in the eyes of the press, pens scribbled with renewed fury, every headline already writing itself in their minds. Still calm, Jasmine placed the next document on the table, a call log cross-referenced with the judge's private line, time-stamped and synced to the exact minute of the recording. As this call occurred during the period in which key financial records went missing From the Planning Commission's database, she continued, the connection is not just clear, it's irrefutable. Another burst of sound filled the courtroom. Journalists whispering, the audience shifting in their seats, defense attorneys exchanging panicked glances. The temperature in the room had changed. Jasmine was no longer the one under scrutiny. Howard Gates was no longer the judge. He was the defendant, the predator cornered. He tried again to regain footing, slamming his gavel so hard the sound cracked like a gunshot. This hearing is over, he shouted. You are out of line, Miss Crockett. But the words had lost their power. They floated, empty, over a courtroom no longer willing to believe him. Jasmine stepped forward, slow and deliberate, the weight of justice behind every movement. You declared my evidence irrelevant. You mocked my credentials. You silenced my arguments, she said, her voice like iron wrapped in velvet. But you can't silence this. She pointed to the transcript. You can't unsay what everyone in this room just heard, and you can't outrun the truth that now has your name etched into it. The judge's hands trembled now, subtly, but Jasmine saw it. Everyone did. It wasn't just the end of a performance, it was the collapse of a regime. A courtroom that had once served as Gates's fortress was now his prison. The room felt different. It pulsed with a new energy, not just righteous anger, but the fragile rising breath of hope. The kind of hope that only comes when someone finally dares to shatter the silence. Jasmine turned back to the gallery, to the jury, to the court reporter whose fingers now flew across the keys with a purpose renewed. The law is not meant to protect the powerful, she said, her voice steady, rising. It is meant to expose the truth, no matter who it threatens. No one spoke. No one needed to. The evidence was undeniable. The mask had been ripped off. Judge Howard Gates had written his own verdict, and Jasmine had simply pressed play. The courtroom stood on the edge of silence, teetering between disbelief and reckoning. The transcript still glowed on the screen behind Jasmine, its damning words echoing like a drumbeat through every mind in the room. The audio recording had finished playing, but its impact hadn't faded. It hung heavy, suffocating. Jasmine turned slowly, deliberately, her gaze locking on the uniformed officer stationed near the rear of the chamber. The room held its breath as she raised her voice. Not loud, but sharp, clear and resonant like a bell-breaking morning silence. Officer Reynolds, she said, not looking away, Timphon Howard Gates is hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice and judicial misconduct. The statement hit like a hammer. The air seemed to shift, as if gravity itself had changed. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes snapped to Gates. For a second, the great judge, the untouchable, the unshakable, sat frozen. His lips parted, but no sound came. His fingers curled tightly around the edges of his bench, turning white with pressure. Then the rage exploded from within him like a dam breaking. "You can't do this!" he roared, standing so quickly that his chair scraped backward with a screech. "No one is allowed to do this to me?" The volume of his voice boomed through the room, but there was no command left in it. It was desperation, wild, unfiltered panic from a man watching his empire collapse around him. "I am this court," he bellowed, as if yelling it would make it true. But the badge of power he'd once wielded now looked brittle, laughable, like a mask crumbling under floodlight. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't step back. Her posture never shifted. She had been belittled, dismissed, torn apart piece by piece in this very room, and now she stood unmoved, while the man who tried to erase her came apart at the seams. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm as ice. "You are not this court. You corrupted it, and today it ends." At her signal, Officer Reynolds stepped forward, boots heavy against the polished floor, each step echoing louder than the last. The sound was not fast, it was deliberate, like a funeral drum announcing the death of unchecked power. Gates flinched as the officer reached the bench, eyes darting, searching the room for someone, anyone who might save him. But there were no allies left. The defense team had gone quiet, their eyes cast downward. The gallery sat frozen, stunned into silence. Even the court reporter, who had typed through every insult and ruling, now paused her keys midair. The judge backed away from the edge of the bench, shaking his head in disbelief, still muttering, "This isn't happening. This isn't how this ends." But the cold steel of the handcuffs gleamed beneath the courtroom lights, undeniable and absolute. Officer Reynolds moved behind him and began reciting the Miranda rights. Gates tried to shake him off, shouting, "This is illegal. This is madness." But his voice had no weight now. His authority was gone. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound cut through the courtroom like thunder, sharp, final, unforgiving. The very same man who had silenced truth with a gavel now stood speechless, shackled by it. Jasmine watched, not with triumph, but with quiet resolve. This wasn't victory. It was justice long delayed, finally crawling out from beneath the rubble of abuse. Gates's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no condescension, only fear. And in her eyes, there was no vengeance, just truth, just consequence. He struggled one last time, yelling, "You'll regret this. I'll bury you." But no one listened. No one cared. His voice faded into nothing, swallowed by the very walls he once controlled. Officer Reynolds led him down the steps from the bench. Each one he descended felt like a lifetime, a fall from the pedestal he'd built on lies and intimidation. The courtroom doors swung open, and the hallway beyond was flooded with flashing lights and waiting reporters. The image would be broadcast across the country before the hour ended. A disgraced judge, once considered untouchable, being led out in cuffs by a woman he had tried to humiliate and destroy. Jasmine remained still, every muscle in her body wound tight. Not because she feared backlash, but because she understood the weight of what had just happened. Justice had not just been served, it had fought tooth and nail to get through the front door. Around her, the room remained eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only follows an earthquake, the kind that doesn't settle, it lingers, it breathes. And then, like a spark catching fire, the first voice rose, a single clap, then another, then a wave. Applause, not for spectacle, not for drama, but for truth, for resilience, for the woman who stood against a system designed to silence her. Jasmine finally allowed herself to exhale. The battle wasn't over. Corruption didn't vanish with one arrest. But today the tide had turned. Today the courtroom remembered its purpose. Charles Lawson sat frozen in his chair, the polished steel of his cufflinks now meaningless compared to the cold dread crawling up his spine. Just moments ago, he had leaned back with smug certainty, protected by the towering figure of Judge Howard Gates, his shield, his firewall, his untouchable ally. But now that shield had shattered in front of a crowd of stunned witnesses. Gates had been hauled out of the courtroom like a common criminal, his cries for control drowned in the sound of handcuffs. Lawson's breath hitched, his once flushed face turned a sickly shade of pale, and his perfectly tailored suit could no longer disguise the tremble in his hands. The room that had once bent to his money was now bending toward truth, and for the first time in years, Charles Lawson felt something he wasn't used to: vulnerability. The mask of power had been ripped off, and all that remained was a man who knew he was next. Jasmine saw it. She had seen it before. The shift in the eyes, the cracking of the facade, the collapse of arrogance into fear. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped toward him, slow and deliberate, each step radiating purpose. Her voice was low but piercing, cutting through the silence that had settled in the courtroom like fog. "Well, Mr. Lawson," she said, stopping just short of his table, "now that your judge is in cuffs, what's your next move? Still planning to stay silent, or are you ready to start thinking about survival?" Her words were calm, but each syllable struck like a gavel. Lawson blinked, lips twitching, mouth dry. He looked around, hoping, praying for a lifeline. But no one moved. No one dared speak. The reporters were locked on him, pens poised. The jury stared with a hunger for truth. The courtroom was no longer his sanctuary. It was a cage. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, swallowing hard. The sweat on his forehead betrayed his internal war, one between loyalty to a crumbling empire and the primal instinct to save himself. Jasmine didn't press. She knew the silence was doing more damage than any accusation could. Lawson shifted in his seat, a man unraveling thread by thread. Then finally, with a voice so hoarse it barely registered, he whispered, "I'll talk." The room didn't move. Jasmine didn't blink. "But I need protection," he added, his eyes now locked onto hers, not with power, but with plea. "If I testify, I want assurances. I want immunity, security, everything." His voice cracked under the weight of desperation, and in that moment, the man who once built towers now looked like one about to collapse. Jasmine stepped closer, never breaking eye contact. "If you want protection," she said, her tone as steady as a judge's verdict, "you'll give me everything. Names, numbers, accounts, contracts. No omissions, no games." Lawson nodded frantically, the calm businessman now reduced to a frightened witness, begging for mercy. "I have documents," he stammered. "Emails, wire transfers, offshore accounts. I kept everything just in case. I didn't think I'd need it, but—" Jasmine raised a hand, stopping him. "Save it for the deposition. Right now, you need to decide if you're ready to walk into that fire. Because if you lie, even once, I'll drag you down myself." Her words didn't rise in volume, but they thundered through the room with finality. Lawson nodded again, slower this time, his breathing ragged. "I'm done lying," he muttered. "I'll give you everything." The tension in the courtroom shifted again. Not lighter, never that, but sharper. Everyone could feel it. A tide had turned. One man in cuffs, another about to turn. Jasmine turned away from him and walked calmly back to her table. But the energy in the room followed her like a current. The woman who had been mocked, insulted, silenced, now stood as the axis around which justice began to spin. Behind her, Lawson sat slumped, no longer the untouchable executive, but the first of many dominoes ready to fall. Jasmine moved with deliberate focus, arranging a fresh stack of documents on the prosecution table with the precision of someone preparing for battle. The courtroom, still reeling from the arrest of Judge Gates and the dramatic capitulation of Charles Lawson, was taut with anticipation. Each new piece of evidence she produced wasn't merely paperwork, it was ammunition, meticulously prepared to target the shadowy network that had flourished unseen for far too long. She took a deep breath, eyes briefly closing, and then opened them to reveal a sharpness honed by years of injustice, dismissals, and silent battles fought behind closed doors. As she lifted the first folder, a palpable electricity surged through the gallery, the jurors leaning forward involuntarily, hungry for more. Jasmine's voice remained firm, authoritative, yet carefully controlled, refusing to betray the intensity of the fire burning beneath her calm exterior. She stepped forward and began presenting her next line of evidence. Bank statements, phone records, and emails, each meticulously verified, each implicating additional figures hidden deep within the city's power structure. With each page she turned, another name emerged from the shadows. Prominent council members, influential bureaucrats, key players in the local political machine. These were men and women who had operated quietly, safely shielded by the power and authority of Judge Gates and the money of Lawson's vast empire. Jasmine's revelations unraveled the carefully woven fabric of their hidden operations, showing a web of collusion and secret alliances. Each piece of evidence was precise, irrefutable, surgically presented to ensure there was no escape, no room for doubt. Her words echoed through the courtroom with a clarity that felt almost brutal. "Here we have emails proving direct communication between city planners and representatives from Lawson's corporation, orchestrating zoning approvals and illegal budget allocations." Jasmine's voice grew sharper, each syllable landing like a targeted strike. "This is not speculation. This is corruption, documented, undeniable, and systemic." Around her, reporters scribbled furiously, knowing that every word Jasmine uttered would shape tomorrow's headlines. The camera shutters clicked rapidly, capturing every subtle shift of her expression, every resolute gesture. The defendants, who had believed themselves untouchable, now sat silent, faces frozen with shock or flushed with quiet rage. Jasmine didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The truth she unveiled wasn't simply incriminating, it was incendiary, igniting anger, disbelief, and a burning demand for accountability. With each revelation, Jasmine pushed the narrative further, exposing how public trust had been betrayed repeatedly, deliberately, without remorse. Her gaze briefly swept across the defendant's table, noting how each powerful figure squirmed beneath the scrutiny of justice long deferred. This was a reckoning, relentless and methodical, and Jasmine Crockett was the unflinching force behind it. As she continued, presenting phone records that aligned perfectly with suspicious transactions, the sense of betrayal in the courtroom grew heavier. Citizens seated in the gallery began exchanging stunned glances, recognizing names and faces once trusted implicitly. The reality sank in. This wasn't just one judge or one businessman. This was a network, an intricate conspiracy that had siphoned away the very integrity of the community. Jasmine paused briefly, holding up a file labeled prominently, City Hall Communications. Her voice hardened further as she opened it, laying bare more damning exchanges. In these records, she said, holding everyone's attention, you'll see direct conversations between senior city officials discussing the cover-up of environmental violations, financial fraud, and outright bribery. Each conversation reveals an indifference to legality, morality, and public welfare. Her tone carried unmistakable contempt, not personal but moral, a reflection of her disgust at the scale of injustice. Jasmine placed another document under the courtroom projector, a detailed spreadsheet with highlighted names of city council members and senior municipal officials. This is just the surface, she stated gravely. The deeper we look, the more we find. Payments hidden as campaign contributions, favors exchanged in secret meetings, the abuse of public office so routine it became invisible. She spoke slowly now, letting each word resonate, allowing the full impact of her revelations to settle heavily into the room. How deep does this rot go? How many trusted public servants have traded their integrity for profit, thinking they would never be caught? The courtroom shifted again, no longer in shock, but in a dawning collective outrage. Jasmine's steady revelations felt relentless, unstoppable, meticulously stripping away every lie until only bare, unvarnished truth remained. Hours passed like minutes, the tension never breaking. Finally, as the day neared its close, Jasmine addressed the judge's now empty seat, her voice resolute but not celebratory. Today's evidence reveals something more than individual crimes, she said. It reveals a systemic betrayal, one built and protected by those who swore oaths to serve justice, not undermine it. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, meeting the gaze of each juror in turn, her sincerity undeniable, her purpose unshakable. If a judge like Howard Gates, a man trusted to uphold the very essence of justice, can willingly conceal such profound corruption, she continued, then we must ask ourselves, who else is lurking behind that curtain, pulling strings, betraying our trust? Her question hung in the air, piercingly sharp, impossible to ignore. Outside the courthouse moments later, beneath glaring camera lights and amidst shouting reporters, Jasmine stood composed but unsmiling. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders burdened by the weight of truths she had carried alone until now. Microphones reached toward her like branches seeking light, desperate for her next statement. She breathed deeply, then spoke slowly, clearly, knowing each word carried immense weight. Today isn't a victory, she began, silencing the crowd instantly. Today is simply exposure. The exposure of rot so deep, so pervasive, that one arrest, one verdict cannot erase it. Her gaze hardened further as she continued. Justice doesn't come from merely removing one corrupt individual. It comes when an entire system is held accountable, when every hidden accomplice faces the consequences of their betrayal. The crowd murmured, cameras flashed again, capturing the intensity of her expression, the gravity in her voice. Jasmine took a moment, then finished with unmistakable resolve. I won't rest until this system is truly cleansed, until public service means transparency, accountability, and justice for everyone, not just the privileged few. As she stepped away, reporters clamored with questions, but Jasmine didn't pause again. She walked with unwavering determination, knowing this was only the beginning of a far longer fight. There was no celebration tonight, no sense of triumph. Only the heavy realization of how deeply rooted the injustice had grown and how much remained undone. As Jasmine climbed into her waiting car, she allowed herself one brief moment of reflection. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, thinking back to every insult, every dismissal, every injustice she'd faced. The courtroom had tried to break her, tried to silence her voice and bury her beneath layers of power and privilege. But Jasmine had survived, unbroken, undeterred. And now the very institutions that had sought to silence her would have to face her again tomorrow, and every day after, until genuine justice prevailed. She opened her eyes, determined and focused, knowing exactly what lay ahead. The battle was far from over, but now she wasn't alone. As her car pulled away, the courthouse faded into the rearview mirror. Jasmine didn't look back. Ahead of her lay the promise not of victory, but of justice truly restored. Painstaking, relentless, hard-earned. This wasn't the end. It was the first chapter in a much larger, more difficult story. But Jasmine was ready for the fight, and justice, delayed but not denied, finally had a voice powerful enough to confront the darkness that had hidden for far too long. In the weeks following Judge Gates's dramatic arrest, Jasmine Crockett's story ignited a wildfire across the legal world. Headlines exploded from every newspaper, every blog, every television network, declaring a seismic shift within the corridors of justice. Jasmine's fearless stand in the courtroom, her quiet defiance in the face of entrenched corruption, was dissected, analyzed, and discussed at every level of academia. Professors at prestigious law schools began referencing her courtroom battle as a defining moment in modern jurisprudence. Her unwavering courage became a case study overnight. Her tactics and strategy meticulously analyzed by students eager to emulate her determination and integrity. Lecture halls that once echoed with dry recitations of old cases now vibrated with spirited discussions about Jasmine's bravery in confronting an unjust system. Her story had transcended the simple facts of a trial. It had become an anthem of resilience, a rallying cry for aspiring legal professionals who had begun to doubt the purity of their chosen path. Suddenly, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a lawyer who had won a high-profile corruption case. She was a symbol of hope, a living example that justice was attainable, even when it felt utterly impossible. Soon, law schools nationwide began inviting Jasmine to speak, eager to capture a fraction of her powerful authenticity in front of their students. She was initially hesitant, remembering the isolation she felt standing alone against Gates's relentless insults and mocking laughter. But soon she realized the importance of sharing her experience, of speaking openly about the bitter sting of injustice that had nearly broken her, yet ultimately sharpened her resolve. On her first appearance at Harvard Law, the lecture hall overflowed, students squeezing into aisles and stairways just to catch a glimpse of the woman whose courage had shattered a corrupted judge's empire. Jasmine stood at the podium, her calm, clear voice resonating with quiet authority as she recounted every devastating moment, the biting insults, the relentless interruptions, the soul-crushing contempt. Her words painted vivid scenes, taking listeners directly into the tension-filled courtroom, allowing them to feel each painful silence, each heart-pounding instant of defiance. She described how Gates had mocked her credentials, dismissed her evidence, and belittled her integrity, hoping to crush her spirit. Yet Jasmine's voice never trembled. Her eyes never wavered as she recounted those moments, transforming each bitter memory into powerful fuel for justice. As Jasmine spoke, an intense silence enveloped the hall. Every eye locked on her as she detailed the precise moment she revealed Gates's voice on the recording, ordering evidence destroyed, sealing his fate. She described vividly how the judge's arrogance collapsed into helpless fury, the gleam of the cuffs reflecting in his eyes, the stunned disbelief of the powerful who had considered themselves untouchable. Her listeners leaned forward, breaths shallow, pulses quickening, as if reliving that electrifying courtroom battle themselves. Jasmine's storytelling brought them face to face with the reality of corruption, vividly illustrating how power could be misused, justice manipulated, and how one determined individual could disrupt even the strongest grip of institutional wrongdoing. Her story wasn't merely about legal victory. It was about the lonely, daunting path of choosing truth over comfort, integrity over compliance. Each word resonated deeply, igniting a fire within every listener, reaffirming the core reason many had chosen the study of law: to confront injustice, no matter the odds. After that first electrifying lecture, Jasmine's inbox was inundated with letters and messages from law students across the nation. Students who saw in her not just a legal success story, but a personal hero. Letters poured in from young women who had faced their own forms of discrimination, subtle or overt, detailing how Jasmine's courage had reignited their belief in themselves. Many of the letters expressed feelings of isolation similar to what Jasmine herself had faced, thanking her for openly acknowledging that the battle against injustice often began as a solitary fight. Some letters, handwritten and deeply personal, came from students who had nearly abandoned their dream of practicing law, disillusioned by the seemingly overwhelming presence of corruption and inequality. Jasmine's struggle, her refusal to be silenced, had become their beacon, pulling them back from the edge of surrender. They wrote passionately, describing how her perseverance had shown them that true strength wasn't found in titles or accolades. It came from standing firm when everyone else urged retreat. As months passed, Jasmine's story became permanently embedded into the curriculum of law schools nationwide. Casebooks added detailed accounts of her courtroom showdown, framing her meticulous preparation and unyielding ethics as a new standard of legal practice. Professors referenced her case not just for its legal precedents, but as a profound example of ethical responsibility, highlighting how Jasmine had exposed systemic rot while enduring public humiliation and intense personal risk. Students no longer discussed Jasmine Crockett merely as a lawyer. They debated her as an embodiment of moral courage and uncompromising integrity. Classroom discussions often evolved into passionate debates on how to maintain ethical clarity in the face of overwhelming pressure, an acknowledgement of the difficult yet essential path Jasmine had walked. Her legacy resonated not through flashy victories, but in the quiet, unwavering strength she had displayed, reminding future lawyers of the true nature of justice, a fight that required unending commitment, not quick celebrations. Recognizing the profound influence of her journey, several leading universities eventually established annual awards in Jasmine's name, honoring students who demonstrated extraordinary courage and moral integrity in legal pursuits. Jasmine herself often found these gestures overwhelming, deeply moved by the idea that her personal struggle could spark such lasting inspiration. Yet she always reminded her audiences that her path had never been heroic or glamorous. It had been painful, isolating, exhausting. The lessons she offered were starkly honest. Fighting injustice was rarely comfortable or applauded. More often, it was lonely and intensely challenging. Jasmine warned her listeners not to romanticize her experience, but to prepare themselves for similar trials. Her truth resonated powerfully. Justice wasn't an easy road, nor was it guaranteed. It required fierce dedication, immense courage, and a relentless willingness to endure ridicule, dismissal, and doubt without ever sacrificing personal integrity. One evening, after another packed lecture, Jasmine sat quietly in her office, surrounded by dozens of heartfelt letters from young legal minds inspired by her journey. She carefully opened one envelope, reading words from a first-year law student who described struggling to find purpose in a profession seemingly tainted by privilege and corruption. The letter concluded with simple gratitude. "Your fight showed me what the law truly can be. Not just a tool for the powerful, but a voice for those who have none. You taught me not to seek applause, but to seek truth. Thank you for showing me the courage I need to fight." Jasmine's eyes softened with emotion, a quiet strength settling deep within her. In that moment, she felt a powerful confirmation that every insult endured, every dismissive glance, every brutal injustice had been worth it. Not for the fame or recognition, but for the ripple of inspiration her solitary stand had created. Slowly placing the letter aside, Jasmine stood, looking through her office window at the city lights flickering below. The path ahead was still uncertain, the fight for justice still fraught with difficulty and hardship. Yet now Jasmine Crockett no longer felt isolated. She knew an entire generation of passionate young lawyers stood ready behind her, inspired by her relentless pursuit of truth. They had seen her face ridicule and emerge stronger, watched her confront injustice alone, armed only with facts and unyielding ethics. Jasmine realized profoundly that she had become not just a symbol of strength, but a catalyst, a spark igniting countless young hearts ready to confront their own battles, ready to uphold justice no matter the cost. With renewed determination, she smiled quietly to herself, knowing her story was now part of a larger narrative, empowering a generation unafraid to challenge corruption. And as Jasmine stepped out into the night, the city seemed brighter, not because injustice had vanished, but because through her courage, a new wave of fearless advocates had found their voice. Jasmine paused, allowing herself a brief, quiet moment of reflection. Outside her window, twilight had fallen, casting long shadows over the city skyline. Shadows that reminded her of battles fought, sacrifices made, and how fragile yet persistent justice truly was. Her desk, illuminated softly by the lamp's glow, was scattered with the letters from students, each one carrying voices full of hope, determination, and gratitude. As her fingers gently brushed the handwritten notes, Jasmine felt something shift profoundly inside her, deeper than pride, stronger than relief, a sense of true purpose, raw and uncompromising. She realized, in that quiet solitude, that every bitter humiliation, every harsh insult, every painful dismissal she endured in Gates's courtroom had not weakened her resolve. Instead, they had forged it into an unbreakable weapon. It wasn't her courtroom victory or the downfall of one powerful man that mattered most. It was this legacy she was now creating, the endless echoes of inspiration born from her courage to stand alone. Rising slowly from her chair, Jasmine approached the window, gazing at the glowing lights that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Her reflection in the glass, once marked by quiet uncertainty, now held a calm, assured strength. She recognized herself clearly for the first time, not as a hero, but as someone who simply refused to accept injustice as normal. The trials she faced were never about personal triumph. They were about proving that true justice was possible, even in the darkest corners of a system corrupted by power and privilege. She saw now that her most significant achievement wasn't simply exposing corruption, it was illuminating the hidden strength within others, inspiring countless souls to find their own voices, to wage their own battles against inequality. Jasmine understood deeply that this fight, her fight, had never been solitary. It had always belonged to everyone who yearned for fairness, everyone who felt silenced by power, everyone who needed reassurance that standing alone, though difficult, could indeed change everything. Stepping away from the window, Jasmine carefully collected the letters into a neat pile, treating each one as a precious artifact of hope. Her thoughts traveled back again to that first day in Gates' courtroom, recalling vividly the weight of his insults, how deeply his dismissals cut, how desperately he had tried to break her spirit. She remembered the moments when doubt crept silently into her heart, whispering that perhaps she wasn't strong enough, wasn't worthy enough to face such monumental opposition. Yet those painful memories no longer felt heavy. Instead, they fueled her resolve, a permanent reminder of what she had overcome. Every mocking word, every act of contempt had become part of the fabric of her strength. Jasmine smiled softly, knowing the cruelty she'd faced had not diminished her. It had sharpened her, transforming hardship into wisdom, insult into insight, isolation into unyielding determination. Those wounds were now badges she wore proudly, reminders not of her victimhood, but of her fierce resilience. Slowly, methodically, Jasmine took one final look around her quiet office. Each corner spoke silently of her journey. The meticulously prepared evidence folders stacked high, the framed photographs of grateful clients whose battles had seemed impossible, the worn volumes of law that had guided her through every dark moment. These were symbols of a life devoted to challenging injustice, evidence of a commitment that had grown stronger each time the world tried to silence her. She realized now deeply and clearly that justice was not an endpoint to be reached and then forgotten. It was an ongoing, relentless process, forever evolving, forever demanding vigilance, courage, and sacrifice. Jasmine understood profoundly that her fight was never about her alone. It was always about something far greater. The collective strength of those who refused to remain silent, who dared to face down power, even if it meant standing alone. Her story, she knew, had become a bridge, connecting isolated individuals into a formidable movement, one voice becoming many, each inspired by a single act of courage. Quietly, she turned off the lamp, letting the comforting darkness fill the room. But the darkness no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful, reflective. It was in this quiet moment that Jasmine fully grasped the depth of her impact. She had not merely achieved justice in one case. She had ignited a movement, inspiring generations to believe in their own power. The truth echoed clearly now. Justice was never granted from above, never given freely by the powerful. Instead, it rose from below, fought for by ordinary people who refused to surrender their voices. Jasmine had become not the hero who rescued them, but rather the spark that reminded them of their own courage, their own worthiness, their own unstoppable strength. This was her true victory, not a legal triumph, but a human awakening, a profound recognition that justice was everyone's responsibility, shared by all who dared to speak out against injustice, even if their voices shook. Stepping into the quiet corridor beyond her office, Jasmine walked slowly toward the elevator, her footsteps echoing softly in the emptiness. As she pressed the button, a voice broke the silence behind her. She turned, startled, to see a young woman standing nervously near the office door, her eyes wide with admiration and a hint of hesitation. The young woman, clearly a law student, clutching a notebook tightly, stepped forward tentatively, her voice soft yet firm. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she began shyly, "but I heard your speech today, your story, your courage. It reminded me why I chose to study law in the first place." Jasmine felt warmth bloom deeply within her chest, the genuine words reaching past her defenses and touching something profoundly real. The young woman continued, voice trembling slightly but growing stronger. "You showed me that even one person can make a difference, that standing alone, even when everyone doubts you, is sometimes the most powerful act of all." Jasmine listened quietly, deeply moved, realizing once again how powerfully interconnected her journey had become with those who came after her. With gentle determination, Jasmine stepped closer to the student, her voice reassuring and sincere. "Remember," she said softly, meeting the student's eyes, "justice isn't something given to us. It's something we create every single day by refusing to remain silent, by daring to speak truth when everyone else chooses comfort. Never underestimate the power you hold simply by deciding you will not look away." The young woman nodded slowly, visibly inspired, her courage visibly strengthened by Jasmine's words. "I won't forget that," she whispered firmly. Jasmine placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, smiling softly. "Good," she said simply, the quiet encouragement in her voice infinitely powerful. "Because the fight for justice isn't easy, but it's always worth it." As Jasmine stepped into the elevator and watched the doors begin to close, the student called out one final, heartfelt question. "But aren't you tired? After all you faced, after standing alone for so long?" Jasmine paused thoughtfully, reflecting deeply before responding, her voice resonant with quiet strength. "Of course I've been tired," she admitted truthfully. "Exhausted sometimes, even discouraged. But I've never been alone, not truly. Every voice that now speaks up, every heart brave enough to challenge injustice, stands beside me. And that, more than anything else, keeps me going. Justice isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, a relay passed on through generations. Each of us carries it forward. Each of us matters." Jasmine smiled gently, knowing these words would remain forever etched in the young student's memory, serving as a guiding star in the difficult moments ahead. Walking out into the cool night air, Jasmine breathed deeply, feeling a renewed sense of purpose flooding her being. The city lights shimmered softly, distant yet vibrant, a perfect reflection of her journey, illuminated by countless struggles, each one transforming darkness into hope. Jasmine Crockett had stood alone, had endured humiliation, injustice, and profound doubt. But in doing so, she had ignited a fire capable of illuminating countless hearts, forever reminding them that true justice, no matter how long delayed, would always be worth fighting for. And as she stepped into the future, Jasmine knew this truth profoundly. Justice didn't need a powerful throne to flourish. It only required someone brave enough to stand up, even when standing alone was the hardest thing imaginable. Her fight wasn't finished. It never would be. But Jasmine felt peace knowing she would never stand alone again. Because through her courage, countless others had learned to rise. If you've ever felt small in the face of power, if you've ever been mocked, ignored, or silenced for daring to speak the truth, this story was made for you. Jasmine's journey is more than just the triumph of justice. It's proof that even a single voice brave enough to speak up can shake an entire system built on injustice. Jasmine stood firm against ridicule, against contempt, and against an overwhelming force determined to crush her. And in doing so, she became a beacon of strength and hope for millions. Remember, you're not alone. Let this story become your strength, your courage, your motivation to raise your voice even louder. Every small voice matters, and when we join together, our collective courage becomes unstoppable. Take action right now, like subscribe and share this story widely, not just to spread inspiration, but to empower those who are still fighting quietly, desperately seeking the courage to stand. Because sometimes it takes only one brave voice to challenge an entire corrupt system, and the next voice to change the world could very well be yours. Judge insults Jasmine Crockett in court. Shocking moment, he's publicly arrested and handcuffed. Jasmine Crockett walked into the courtroom like she was walking into a storm she already knew was rigged against her. There was no applause, no welcome, not even a nod of respect from the bench, only a chill in the air that wrapped around her like a noose. The mahogany walls, polished to a shine, seemed to absorb the sound of her heels clicking across the floor. Reporters looked up lazily from their notepads. The gallery was sparsely filled, yet she felt like every seat was occupied by a ghost of silence, waiting to see her fail. At the prosecution table, she set down her briefcase and adjusted her blazer with quiet precision. She hadn't said a word yet. She hadn't opened a file, but from the bench, the voice of Judge Howard Gates cracked across the air like a whip dipped in poison. "Well, well," Gates drawled, leaning back in his chair. "If it isn't Miss Crockett, I hope today's performance is shorter than your last one. Some of us have real cases to hear." The insult came not like a jab, but a public sentence, slow, measured, and designed to humiliate. A few soft chuckles rippled through the defense bench. Jasmine didn't flinch. She met the judge's gaze with the quiet defiance of someone who had long accepted that justice rarely came without a fight. Gates smirked. "I assume you're here to dazzle us with paperwork and progressive buzzwords." Again. He didn't look at the docket. He didn't glance at her materials. He just let the words hang like smoke, curling in the silence. "Remind me, how many of your crusades have actually amounted to anything? One? Half?" Across the aisle, Charles Lawson relaxed in his seat, utterly at ease. His attorney whispered something into his ear, and Lawson let out a small, smug laugh. They weren't worried. Why should they be? The referee had already picked a side. Jasmine turned slightly toward the bench, her expression composed but her posture tight as wire. She opened her mouth, but Gates raised his hand. Not in permission, but dismissal. "Let me save you the trouble," he said. "You're going to tell us about taxpayer dollars. You're going to paint a villain, and then you're going to waste my time with half-baked outrage disguised as prosecution." He rested his chin on one hand and waved the other lazily toward the gallery. "Honestly, Miss Crockett, if I wanted theatrics, I'd watch late-night TV." The court stenographer paused, unsure whether to type that last line. A bailiff coughed awkwardly. The jurors didn't meet her eyes. Jasmine's presence in the room was being chipped away before she could even speak a full sentence. The authority of her role, the gravity of the case, meant nothing here. Not in this courtroom, not under Gates. "Do you even understand what burden of proof means?" Gates added, voice now dipping into condescension. "Or are you hoping sheer passion will substitute for facts this time?" The words weren't just dismissive, they were meant to degrade, He wasn't engaging in legal scrutiny. He was indulging in character assassination, cloaked in judicial robes. Jasmine held her position, unmoved, but something deeper stirred beneath the surface. She scanned the faces in the room, not for support, but for signs of life. She found none, just silence, discomfort, and complicity. She was alone, utterly and absolutely. But she was used to that, and that, more than anything, frightened the people who built courtrooms like this. People like Gates, because they didn't know what to do with someone who stood their ground even as the floor was pulled out from under them. But still, his voice came again. "I suggest you keep today's speech brief, Miss Crockett. The court's patience is thin, and frankly, so is mine." And with that, he looked away, not as a judge ending a statement, but as a king dismissing a nuisance. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. Jasmine didn't move. Not yet. Not until she was ready. And when she finally did speak, it would not be with fire. It would be with precision. Because they hadn't seen the last of her. They'd only seen the beginning of how far they were willing to go to keep her silent, and how far she would go to speak. Jasmine Crockett advanced to the screen, her fingers moving with precision as she clicked through the slides. The numbers appeared in bold: official city budgets, line items, wire transfer receipts, cold, hard data that painted a damning picture. "Here," she began, voice calm but firm, "is the original budget approved for the Harborfront Revitalization Project, $6 million. However, as you can see from these transfer logs, the amount funneled into Barrington Industries accounts totals more than $18 million. She turned slightly, facing the judge, her tone unwavering. "That's over 3 times the allocated funding. The documents supporting these figures were subpoenaed directly from the city's financial archives and cross-referenced with the defendant's internal ledgers." She took a step back, letting the weight of the evidence settle into the room. For a moment, the silence was almost respectful. Almost. Then came the voice from the bench, laced with disdain and boredom. "Miss Crockett," Judge Gates sighed, leaning forward with a smirk, "you're not seriously expecting this courtroom to gasp at a few inflated numbers, are you?" He picked up a pen, spun it between his fingers, and glanced at the gallery as if searching for an audience to share his amusement. "This courtroom has seen its fair share of political theater, but I must say you've brought a fresh spin on an old routine. Dramatic slideshows, financial acrobatics. What's next? A monologue about truth and justice?" A few quiet laughs echoed from the defense side. Gates chuckled lowly. "Let's be honest. These numbers, they're a distraction, a smokescreen. No one in here is losing sleep over decimal points and accounting tricks." Jasmine didn't blink. "Your Honor," she began, keeping her voice level, "under Title 18, Section 666 of the Federal Code, misappropriation of public funds in excess of $5,000 constitutes a criminal offense. We're not discussing decimal points. We're discussing criminal liability." But Gates waved his hand dismissively, cutting her off before the sentence could land. "Oh, please, don't quote statutes at me like I'm a first-year law student. I've been sitting on this bench longer than you've been in this profession, Miss Crockett. Spare us the courtroom lecture." He leaned back, arms crossed, lips curled. "And let's not pretend your stack of documents somehow compensates for the weakness of your argument. All those folders you've lugged in, it's like watching someone try to build a castle out of sand, with extra footnotes." The room grew colder. Jasmine could feel it, not just hostility, but the slow, deliberate erosion of her voice. This wasn't about the case. It wasn't about justice. This was about power. It was about control. She looked at the jury. Some eyes were cast down. Others were wide but vacant, unsure of what they were witnessing or if they were even allowed to question it. Gates's words had weight not because they were true, but because they were law in that moment. No one corrected him. No one dared. And that was the point. She took another breath, grounding herself. "The volume of documentation is necessary, Your Honor, to show a consistent pattern over a span of 3 fiscal quarters. This isn't an isolated mistake. It's a structured, deliberate redirection of funds from public projects into private gain." But Gates had already stopped listening. He turned to the court reporter and muttered something under his breath, then looked back at Jasmine with theatrical exhaustion. "Miss Crockett, you may enjoy the sound of your own voice, but the rest of us have lives to return to." He tapped his gavel once, not in conclusion, but in mock punctuation. "You're beginning to confuse obsession with relevance. And to be frank, I don't appreciate having my time wasted by ambition dressed up as law." The defense table was grinning now. Lawson leaned back in his chair like he was watching a show written just for him. His lawyer crossed his legs, one hand over his mouth to hide the growing smirk. Jasmine, meanwhile, stood in the eye of a storm no one else could feel. One of bias, institutional cruelty, and precision-targeted humiliation. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, but her face remained expressionless. She refused to give them more satisfaction. She refused to fold. But the isolation was complete. Her team behind her sat still, silent, unsure if speaking would help or simply drag them into the same fire. And yet she didn't sit down. Not yet. Because doing so would mean conceding that evidence didn't matter here. That power spoke louder than proof. That smirks and glares carried more authority than numbers, signatures, or law. She stood unmoving, her binder still open in front of her, its pages filled with facts that no one wanted to hear. And for the first time in the entire trial, Jasmine understood the full weight of what she was up against. Not just a corrupt developer, not just a hostile judge, but a system that had no room for truth unless it was spoken by the right people, in the right tone, from the right side of the courtroom. She was none of those things, but she was still standing. Jasmine turned another page in the binder, her voice unwavering, precise. "The discrepancy in funding allocations begins in the fourth quarter of 2022. The transactions were signed off not only by senior executives, but also by the former head of internal finance, Raymond Bell." The moment the name left her lips, a ripple of stillness spread across the room like a shockwave. It wasn't visible to most, but Jasmine caught it instantly. The slight shift in posture, the subtle flicker of reaction on Judge Gates's face. His hand, mid-scribble, froze for just a breath. His jaw tensed. His eyes, previously glazed with arrogance, narrowed like the light had suddenly changed direction. It lasted no more than a second. But for someone trained to read faces, it was loud. She had touched something raw, something buried, and in that instant, she knew Raymond Bell was more than a name on paper. He was a key, and Gates knew it. The judge didn't speak right away. He shifted in his chair, clearing his throat with exaggerated control. Then casually, too casually, he reached for his gavel and tapped it once. Not out of order, but as a signal. "Miss Crockett," he said, his voice unusually even, "approach the bench." The request was not optional, and everyone in the room felt it. Jasmine straightened her blazer, her heels clicking softly against the courtroom floor as she stepped forward. The gallery fell silent. Even Lawson stopped smirking. When she reached the bench, Gates didn't look at her immediately. He leaned forward slightly, bringing his voice down to a whisper meant for her ears alone. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was laced with something cold and corrosive. "Some battles," he said slowly, "aren't meant for the faint of heart." Jasmine didn't flinch, but the air between them turned sharp. His words weren't a suggestion. They were a threat. Jasmine walked back to the prosecution table with the weight of the judge's whisper still clinging to her ears like frost. Her heels struck the floor in perfect rhythm, but her thoughts ran uneven. Judge Gates's voice replaying like a looping warning. Some battles aren't meant for the faint of heart. She didn't flinch, didn't stumble, but something about the silence in the courtroom felt off now. Too still, too aware. As she adjusted the files on the table, her instinct pulled her eyes toward the gallery, not in search of anything in particular, but out of that quiet sixth sense that told her someone was watching. And someone was. Back row, far left. A man in a plain gray coat, head slightly bowed, but his eyes were locked on her like he'd been waiting years for this exact moment. Her breath caught, her body stilled. She knew that face. Older now, leaner, more shadow than flesh. But it was him, Raymond Bell, the ghost, the man who vanished 3 years ago after blowing the whistle on Barrington's fraudulent contracts. The man whose name had become a cautionary tale whispered in legal circles and press rooms alike. He had tried to speak once. Then he disappeared. No trial, no headlines, no farewell. And yet here he was, sitting calmly in the shadows of a courtroom where his name had just been resurrected. Jasmine didn't know if he had come for her or to warn her. Raymond didn't blink. He didn't move. He just looked at her, through her, like someone staring at the final page of a story he already knew the ending to. His expression wasn't fear or pity. It was something far colder. Resignation, a quiet message carved into his gaze. You've stepped into something bigger than you realize. Jasmine felt the chill crawl up her arms like smoke from a fire she hadn't seen yet. She didn't look away, and neither did he. There were no words between them, just a long, loaded silence that spoke volumes. She wanted to rise, to call his name, to ask how he survived, where he had gone, what he had seen. But she didn't move. She couldn't, because something about the way he looked at her said, "Don't draw attention. They're already watching." Then with slow and deliberate movement, Raymond stood. He didn't look left or right, didn't nod, didn't gesture. He simply walked out of the courtroom like a shadow fading into fog. No one called after him, no one tried to stop him, and no one even seemed to notice he'd been there at all. But Jasmine noticed. And the moment he passed through the exit door, the room changed. It was like someone had opened a window to winter. The temperature dropped. The lights suddenly felt too bright, the ceiling too low. Even the air had weight, like it didn't want to be breathed. It wasn't fear exactly. It was consequence. It was the presence of a truth so heavy, no one dared name it out loud. Jasmine sat, her hands resting on the files, but her mind miles away. She had just made eye contact with a man who'd lost everything for trying to do what she was doing now. And unlike her, he hadn't had cameras, or a support team, or even a voice loud enough to echo past a headline. They had erased him, and now he had returned, not to fight, but to remind. And if she wasn't careful, she would be next. The system wasn't broken. It was perfectly engineered to make people like Raymond and her disappear quietly. But this time someone was watching, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't ready to vanish. Not yet. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not after the judge's threats, not after the smug grins from the defense table, and not after seeing Raymond Bell vanish into the shadows. She wasn't built to retreat. She leaned forward, her voice level, her fingers tight around the final folder. One she hadn't planned to reveal this early. But the rules of this game had changed the moment the system started showing its cracks. She opened it slowly, deliberately, as if placing a dagger on the table. "Your Honor," she said, her words slicing through the stillness. "This is a signed authorization for a wire transfer dated July 14th of last year. The amount, $2.4 million. The recipient, Lawson's Shell subsidiary, Tetra Pacific Holdings." She turned the document to face the courtroom. "And the authorizing signature belongs to you." The room didn't breathe. Not for a second. Even the court reporter froze, unsure whether to keep typing or lift her head. The judge's name echoed like a loaded gunshot in a room full of gas. Gates's face hardened instantly, his skin flushing, his jaw tight. "That's enough," he said, his voice trembling. Not with fear, but fury. Jasmine continued unshaken. "The signature has been verified by a third-party forensic analyst and cross-referenced against prior court filings. This is not a fabrication." She projected the scanned copy onto the courtroom screen, zooming in on the distinct loops and slants of the pen stroke. "This signature authorized the transfer of public development funds into a private account linked directly to the defendant. There is no ambiguity here." Gates slammed his gavel down like he was trying to crush something beneath it. "This is outrageous," he barked. "This document is inadmissible." His voice had risen an octave, cracking in places where it was usually smooth and controlled. "It was improperly obtained, illegally sourced. This court will not recognize it." The shock rolled across the room like thunder. A man in the gallery muttered, "Did he just say his own signature is inadmissible?" Another whispered, "Why is he yelling?" The jury looked stunned, confused. And in that confusion, Jasmine saw something more important than outrage. doubt. She kept her tone measured. Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed through official channels as part of the financial disclosure process. Its source is legal, its contents are clear. She stepped closer to the bench, not out of aggression, but precision. Dismissing it without review is a violation of both due process and the public's right to a fair trial. Gates stood now, his face a mask of indignant rage. Sit down, Miss Crockett. I said it's inadmissible. That decision is final. The silence that followed wasn't compliance. It was tension, coiled so tight it could snap with a whisper. People were no longer just watching a trial. They were watching a reckoning. Jasmine didn't sit. Her eyes scanned the courtroom. The reporters, pens now scribbling furiously. The jurors, some leaning forward. The defense attorney no longer smirking. And Lawson, his mask of calm had cracked. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, his eyes darting toward the judge. Jasmine turned her gaze back to Gates, her voice lower now but sharper. You're not rejecting the evidence because it's invalid. You're rejecting it because it names you. That landed like a grenade tossed into sacred ground. Someone gasped. Another person stood up in the back, only to be pulled down by a bailiff. Jasmine's words didn't echo. They rang. Gates's fist slammed the bench. Enough, he thundered. This hearing is dangerously close to contempt. His face was red, his composure shredded. I will not allow this courtroom to become a circus. But it already had. Not because of Jasmine, because of him. Because in trying so hard to bury the truth, he had just confirmed it lived inside him. The murmurs turned into low conversations. The gallery was no longer neutral. Something had changed. Power had shifted, and Jasmine knew it. She let the silence stretch before she spoke again. With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe the circus began the moment this court started protecting the accused instead of the evidence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words weren't fire. They were ice, and they cut deeper because of it. She turned to the jury. You've seen the documents. You've heard the denials, and now you've witnessed what happens when the truth gets too close to power. She looked back at Gates. Do what you must, but know this. Every person in this room saw what just happened. The gavel slammed down like a guillotine, sharp and final. This document is inadmissible, Judge Gates barked, his voice no longer controlled but seething with barely veiled rage. And this courtroom will not be hijacked by baseless distractions. His eyes locked onto Jasmine like a warning shot before he turned abruptly to the gallery. 15-minute recess, he snapped coldly, and the words echoed like steel doors slamming shut. He didn't wait for objection or reaction. He simply rose and vanished through the rear chamber, like a man escaping something behind him. A ripple of discomfort moved through the courtroom, like the collective realization that something had gone very wrong. Jasmine stood still for a moment, watching the door close behind him, then quietly gathered her things as murmurs and uneasy glances filled the space he had left behind. She walked quickly through the corridors, heels tapping like a metronome counting down. No one stopped her. No one dared. Her mind was a storm, anger, suspicion, calculation, but her face was a mask. Inside the prosecution's private room, she shut the door behind her and let out the breath she'd been holding since the gavel struck. The silence hit like a punch to the chest. No audience, no judge, no pressure. Just her, four walls, and the growing sense that she was no longer just trying a case. She was standing on the edge of something deeper. She moved to the table, began sifting through her folders, reviewing documents with mechanical precision. But then she saw it. Something that didn't belong. It was wedged between her witness index and evidence log. A beige envelope, plain and unmarked. No seal, no court insignia, no handwriting on the outside. Jasmine froze. She hadn't placed it there. No one on her team had touched these folders since they left her briefcase. Her breath tightened. She reached for it slowly, heart thudding as if she were defusing a bomb. The paper was heavier than standard court stock, like it had been passed hand to hand, not printed from a machine. She opened the flap and pulled out a single sheet, folded twice, the handwriting crisp, deliberate, unmistakably human. Vault B17, Courthouse Archives, basement level. Code 491726. If you still believe in the truth, open it. RB Jasmine's hand trembled slightly as she held the note. She stared at the initials. RB, there was no doubt in her mind. Raymond Bell, the man who had become a whisper, the man who had once tried to do what she was doing now, and paid for it with his silence. Her throat tightened. The room suddenly felt colder, the fluorescent lights too harsh. She sat down slowly, the note resting in her lap like a message from the dead. How had it gotten here? When? She had been watched. No other explanation. Someone had slipped it in, right under the nose of the system that was trying to suffocate her. Someone wanted her to keep digging, and someone had just handed her a shovel. She looked at the note again, absorbing every word like scripture. A vault in the basement, a code. This wasn't rumor. This was a direct invitation, a risk, a warning, and a promise. The room felt like it was shrinking. The clock on the wall ticked loudly now. 12 minutes left in recess. She could wait. She could return to the courtroom, follow the script, let the trial grind forward inch by inch. Or she could move, right now, into the unknown, into the space where the truth was no longer speculation, but something buried beneath concrete and keypads. She stood. Her body moved before her mind had finished weighing the odds, because something inside her already knew. Whatever was behind Vault B17 was not just evidence, it was everything. Absolutely. Below is a 700-word cinematic narrative written entirely in English, focused precisely on the moment Jasmine accesses Vault B17 and discovers the damning contents. The tone remains intense and emotionally charged, with immersive detail and the feeling of a thriller unfolding, beat by beat. The basement air was colder than she expected, stale, still, and heavy with secrets. Jasmine moved quickly through the corridor, her footsteps light but purposeful, every sense heightened like she was walking into enemy territory. The hum of distant ventilation echoed off concrete walls as she scanned each vault number until she found it. B17, unmarked, unassuming, but pulsing with invisible weight. She reached into her blazer, pulled out the folded note, and stared once more at the code written in that steady hand. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, hesitating only for a breath before she entered it. 491726. A soft mechanical click. The lock disengaged. Her heart beat once, hard in her chest. Then she opened the door. Inside was no pile of files, no dramatic evidence strewn in chaos. It was precise, deliberate. A small, black, external hard drive, a sealed envelope, and a thin folder labeled simply, Internal Only, Restricted Access. Jasmine reached in with care, pulling the contents into the dim overhead light. Her fingers gripped the hard drive first, cool and solid, a vessel that felt far heavier than its size. This wasn't backup data or archived financials. This was something built to be hidden, until now. She placed it on the table beside her, then carefully unsealed the envelope. Inside, printed transcripts, screenshots, and email chains. She read just the subject lines and her breath caught. Movement of discretionary funds. Project shielding. From Howard.Gates at statecourt.gov to Charles.Lawson at barringtongarpy.com. Her eyes scanned faster now, flipping pages, absorbing more than reading. There were emails between Judge Gates and Lawson. Direct coordination, not just bias. Instructions, approvals, cover stories. Dates matched exactly with the suspicious transfers she had tried to present in court. She opened the folder next. Charts, tables, and expense breakdowns. Only they didn't match public records. These were fake budgets, entirely different from the ones submitted to the city. Doctored allocations, hidden totals, names removed. It was fraud carved in ink, and worse, signed off by the very people trusted to prevent it. She picked up the hard drive, hands trembling now. A folded note taped to the bottom. Play clip folder 03, timestamp 2217. The label sent a chill down her spine. Jasmine didn't have time to listen here, but the implication was unmistakable. audio recordings, the kind that proved everything the emails suggested, and more. Meetings, conversations, voice signatures. Raymond Bell hadn't just collected documents. He had captured the betrayal as it happened, and now he had passed it all to her. A rush of emotion surged through her chest, not just vindication, but grief. Grief for the time lost, the lives ruined, the people crushed under the weight of a system that played God behind courtroom walls. This was never just about Lawson. It was about the rotted root he grew from, and Gates had been watering it for years. Jasmine closed the vault door behind her and tucked the drive and files into her case. The silence of the basement now felt different, no longer just empty, but aware, like it had been watching her this whole time. She checked the time. 3 minutes left in recess. Enough. Just enough. As she hurried back up the stairs, the documents pressed tight against her side. She could feel something shift inside her. Fear was still there, yes, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had turned into fire. She had been mocked, dismissed, isolated in plain sight. They thought they'd buried the truth under arrogance and robes, but they hadn't buried it deep enough, not for someone willing to dig with her bare hands. Jasmine Crockett wasn't walking back into that courtroom to argue anymore. She was walking back with a loaded weapon, made of facts, names, and voices. And this time, the judge wouldn't be the one doing the sentencing. The courtroom doors swung open, and Jasmine Crockett stepped back inside, not as the battered prosecutor they'd tried to bury, but as the keeper of something far more dangerous than theory, the truth. Her walk was steady, controlled, but every step carried the pulse of revolution. The gallery buzzed faintly with whispers that died the moment she crossed the threshold. The jury had returned. The reporters had their pens ready. Gates had resumed his seat, chin slightly lifted, face carved from marble, but his eyes flicked toward her with a tension he couldn't conceal. Jasmine moved to her table, placed a small black recorder gently beside her notes, and for a moment the room felt like it was holding its breath. Then she pressed play. A low, grainy voice filled the room. Male, confident, cold. Make sure the girl never gets her hands on the ledgers. If she does, burn them. I don't care what it takes. The words cracked across the courtroom like lightning. Jasmine didn't say a thing. She didn't look up. She just let the recording play. If she pushes harder, we bury the case. If it gets messy, we bury her too. Under procedure. Under silence. A gasp broke from the back row. A juror's pen dropped to the floor. Even the defense team stiffened, eyes flicking toward Gates, who sat motionless, but no longer in control. Jasmine paused the recording. She looked directly at the judge, and for the first time in that trial, he looked away. He wasn't hiding disdain now. He was hiding panic. The courtroom didn't need explanation. They had just heard the voice of conspiracy, the voice of a system weaponized against the very people it claimed to protect. Jasmine's voice was calm when she finally spoke. This audio was recovered during the recess from a secured archive. The voice belongs to a man who has conspired with both the defendant and the bench to obstruct justice. There was no need to name him. Every person in that room knew exactly whose voice had been captured in that moment of quiet violence. Judge Howard Gates, guardian of the law, arbiter of fairness, had just been unmasked as an architect of corruption. The silence was suffocating. Gates opened his mouth, perhaps to object, to deflect, to destroy, but nothing came. Just breathe. Just the sound of his empire cracking under the weight of undeniable truth. Jasmine stood slowly. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, but her voice carried with the precision of a scalpel. Your Honor, what this courtroom just heard is not misinterpretation. It is intent. It is conspiracy. It is you. Gates's lips trembled, barely perceptible, as his eyes darted to the jury, to the gallery, to the bailiff. But there was no refuge in their stares, no rescue, no reverence. Jasmine continued, stepping forward one pace. For days I've presented evidence, ledgers, budgets, signatures, and every piece was ignored, ridiculed, or silenced. Now the court has heard the reason why. Her voice sharpened, every syllable striking like a hammer. The law has not failed here. It was hijacked, and the hijacker is seated on the bench. The tension was electric. The jury leaned forward in unison. Even the stenographer's keys stopped clicking. Gates slammed his gavel once. Just once. A desperate attempt to reclaim control. This is inadmissible. Fabricated. I will not allow this farce to continue, he barked, but it was too late. His voice cracked, lost its edge. The illusion was broken. Jasmine didn't flinch. You don't get to decide that anymore, she said, eyes locked on him like a sword drawn from its sheath. The court has already heard it. The people have already seen you. Every face in the courtroom now turned to him, not as a figure of authority, but as a defendant caught in real time. The room wasn't on his side anymore, and he knew it. The silence in the courtroom was no longer heavy. It was sharp, electric, stretched thin across every breath and heartbeat in the room. All eyes were locked on Jasmine, the woman who had just shattered the illusion of justice with a single recording. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move quickly. She simply lifted her hand and gave a subtle nod, calm, precise, almost ceremonial. The sound of the rear courtroom doors opening cut through the air like a blade. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence sudden and absolute, moving with quiet authority toward the bench. Judge Howard Gates didn't move. His eyes followed them, disbelief flickering beneath the surface of his otherwise rigid expression. Jasmine remained where she was, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her voice was steady, louder now so that the entire courtroom could hear, each word like a gavel strike. Judge Howard Gates, she said, her tone neither mocking nor vengeful. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and conspiracy. The gallery gasped, a sound that rippled through the walls like wind through glass. Gates blinked once, slowly. For the first time since the trial began, he looked small, not because of the badge or the title he once wore, but because of what he no longer could deny. The officers flanked him without hesitation. Sir, one of them said, reaching for the cuffs, please place your hands in front of you. Gates didn't speak. His lips parted slightly, as if words were forming but couldn't find the courage to land. His hands hovered in place, not quite resisting, not quite surrendering. The weight of the moment hung like a final sentence, and when the metal clicked around his wrists, it was deafening. The man who had once ruled from the bench now stood cuffed before it, stripped not just of power, but of illusion. Charles Lawson, seated just feet away, jolted upright, panic overtaking the smug composure he had worn like armor since the first day of trial. This is a setup, he shouted, his voice rising, trembling. This is political. This is insane. His lawyer reached for him, whispering frantically, but Lawson pushed him away, eyes darting to Gates like a drowning man watching the lifeguard go under. The gallery erupted, not with chaos, but with reaction. Gasps, phones raised, reporters scribbling at lightning speed. The courtroom, once locked in fear, now pulsed with a kind of awakening, a reckoning. Jasmine watched it unfold without a smile, without triumph. Her face was still, composed, but her eyes, those told a different story. They held the fire of every insult swallowed, every truth ignored, every hour spent screaming into the void while the system laughed in her face. Now it wasn't laughing. Now it was bleeding. Gates said nothing as he was led around the bench. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at anyone. His world was crumbling too loudly inside his head to notice anything outside of it. The very laws he had twisted were now snapping back like steel jaws. The judge's seat remained empty, but the power it once symbolized had already shifted. Jasmine took a slow breath, standing tall in the eye of a storm she had refused to let swallow her. Around her the foundation shook. One brick of corruption pulled loose, causing others to fall in sequence. The prosecutor's bench wasn't a place of struggle anymore. It was now ground zero for the collapse of a lie that had ruled unchallenged for too long. Behind her, her team exchanged glances of stunned awe, but Jasmine didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, grounded in the gravity of the moment. A reporter near the front stood halfway, his voice unsteady but clear. Miss Crockett, he asked, did you know the recording would lead to this? Jasmine turned her gaze toward him. her tone soft but unwavering. I knew the truth would lead somewhere. I just didn't expect the path to be this quiet until it broke. Her words hung in the air, neither celebratory nor bitter, just real. That was her weapon all along, not theatrics, not showmanship, just relentless, undeniable reality, spoken even when no one wanted to hear it. As the courtroom doors closed behind Judge Gates, as the cuffs carried him into history, the room settled into an eerie stillness. No more shouting, no more lies. Just the presence of something rare. Justice, unfiltered, raw, unfinished. And at its center stood Jasmine Crockett, not as a victor basking in glory, but as a survivor of a war that had never been meant to be fought fairly. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Because she knew this wasn't the end. Absolutely. Below is a 1,500-word cinematic narrative, written in English, based on your exact prompt. The scene unfolds just after Judge Gates is arrested and focuses on Lawson panicking and begging for a deal, Jasmine refusing to let him off easy, rejecting the idea of compromise after the court was sold out. Jasmine demanding a full investigation, not only into Lawson, but into everyone who collaborated with Gates. The tone remains taut, intense, and emotionally searing, like a final act in a legal thriller. The doors hadn't even finished closing behind Judge Gates when Charles Lawson stood up like the floor beneath him had vanished. His face, moments ago smug and assured, was now drained of color. His voice cracked before the words fully formed. "Wait," he stammered, raising a hand, palm open, like he could push back what had already come crashing down. "This is getting out of hand. We don't need to take this any further. We can work something out." His lawyer tried to grab his arm to sit him down, but Lawson shook him off like dead weight. "Ms. Crockett, let's be reasonable." Jasmine didn't even flinch. She stood steady behind her table, the room still thick with the aftershock of Gates's arrest. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen mid-sentence. Lawson took a step forward, desperation leaking into every word now. "I have information," he said quickly. "Names, documents, things that would take you years to uncover. Give me immunity, and I'll give you everything." He tried to sound in control, but his voice was rising, unraveling with every breath. "I can help you. I can help fix this." Jasmine's expression didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but each word struck like a hammer. "You want a deal?" she said. "After this court was sold from the inside out?" She took a step forward, her stare locked on Lawson like a spotlight. "After witnesses were silenced, ledgers erased, and justice buried beneath signatures and bribes?" She gestured toward the empty judge's bench, now a symbol of betrayal. "You want to negotiate when the bench itself was bought?" Her tone was flat, cold. "You don't deserve a deal. You deserve exposure." Lawson opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Jasmine cut through the silence like a blade. "This isn't damage control anymore. This is a purge." The room froze. The phrase hung in the air, more than a threat, an intent. Jasmine turned to the clerk. "I am submitting a formal motion to the district office. Immediate expansion of this investigation to include every individual, every office, every contract that passed through Judge Gates's hands." She raised her voice now, loud enough for the gallery and press to hear. This conspiracy didn't end with a signature. It was enabled, repeated, protected. Her eyes swept the room. "And we're going to find out who protected it." The clerk nodded, stunned. One of the jurors covered her mouth. Reporters had abandoned their notepads in favor of cameras, phones up, and recording. It was no longer just a trial. It was a reckoning. Lawson stood frozen, lips parted like he still expected someone to object, to call for order, to remind the court that deals were possible, that influence still mattered. But no one moved. No one came. Because for the first time, no one was afraid of him anymore. Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. "Every decision Judge Gates made is now under review. Every ruling, every motion denied, every case thrown out. If even one of those decisions was influenced by outside interest, we'll expose it." She turned back to Lawson. "And anyone who profited from it, Anyone who helped protect it will answer for it, including you." Lawson was shaking now. His lawyer was whispering furiously in his ear, but the man looked dazed, barely hearing a word. Jasmine didn't look away. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't enjoying the sight. She was fulfilling a promise to the system, to the people it failed, and to herself. "You used your money to build a wall around the truth," she said, "but walls crack, and now that we've seen through one, we're going to tear the rest of them down." She turned toward the gallery, addressing not just those present, but every viewer who would see this moment replayed 1,000 times. This wasn't about one corrupt businessman. It was about a system that let him operate unchecked, a system that needs cleansing, not compromise. The judge's chair stood empty behind her, but Jasmine's presence filled the courtroom. She wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. She was the embodiment of what happens when silence is broken with precision, when truth is delivered not in outrage, but with undeniable clarity. She walked back to her table, eyes scanning the courtroom as she passed Lawson. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared, his world collapsing piece by piece around him. The foundation he thought would never crack had turned to dust in less than an hour. Jasmine opened her briefcase, retrieving a secondary file, the one with names, connections, firms, and favors. She didn't wave it around. She simply placed it on the table, in full view. "We start with Lawson," she said to her team, her voice level, "but we don't stop with him." Her lead investigator nodded. The energy in the room had shifted. No longer a battle for one verdict, but a campaign against an entire machine. The courtroom was no longer just a place for argument. It had become a war room. The clerk received a call from the district office. A second judge would be stepping in to replace Gates. Trial proceedings would resume, this time under the eyes of a public that would no longer settle for closed doors and quiet bribes. Jasmine turned to face the jury. "I know what you've witnessed today was more than any of us expected, but it was also necessary, because justice delayed has never meant justice denied. It's only meant justice was hidden, until now." And for the first time, the jury didn't look confused or overwhelmed. They looked ready. In the gallery, a woman who had sat silently for hours began to clap. One clap, then another. It spread, not raucous, not disruptive, but deliberate, like applause at the end of something false and the beginning of something real. Jasmine didn't react. She didn't smile, but her hands tightened just slightly at her sides, anchored by the weight of what had been fought for and what still remained ahead. Outside the courthouse, the world was already stirring, headlines forming, cameras rolling. But inside, the fire had only just started, and Jasmine Crockett, finally truly, was holding the match. And just when the courtroom thought the storm had passed, the door opened, carrying with it the weight of a name long buried but never forgotten. The courtroom was different now, not louder, not brighter, just heavier. The kind of weight that settles when a storm has passed but left the air charged with something unspoken. The judge's bench was now occupied by a newly appointed federal magistrate, one chosen for neutrality, for integrity, anything that didn't resemble the ruin left behind by Howard Gates. The walls still held the echoes of truth finally spoken, of power finally unmasked. But what came next wasn't about one man's fall. It was about the fire he'd nearly buried, and the one man who'd been burned by it before anyone else, Raymond Bell. The door opened quietly. No announcement, no fanfare, just the soft creak of hinges and the low murmur of a room remembering a name it hadn't dared speak in 3 years. Raymond Bell entered with slow, deliberate steps, every inch of him marked by survival. His hair was grayer, his posture heavier, but his eyes were wide open now. The courtroom stilled. Even the cameras adjusted their angle. This wasn't just a witness. This was a man the system had tried to erase, and now he had returned, not in silence, but in strength. Jasmine watched from her seat at the front, her hands folded atop a single folder, her expression unreadable. She had seen Raymond only in passing, in fragments, once through glass, once in shadow. Now he was stepping into the light, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the gravity of it. He was here. He had chosen to return. And he had done it because she hadn't stopped. Raymond raised his hand, was sworn in, and sat. The silence was total. The judge asked him to state his name for the record. He did. Then he paused and spoke. "I was the director of financial oversight for Barrington Group," Raymond began, his voice quiet but unwavering. "3 years ago, I submitted a whistleblower report documenting deliberate misappropriation of public development funds. The evidence I provided implicated multiple senior executives, Charles Lawson among them. I submitted my report through the proper legal channels. Within 72 hours, my access was revoked. My office was emptied. I was placed under an internal investigation, and then I vanished." His words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They carried the weight of truth crushed beneath bureaucracy and fear. "I was warned," he continued, "not formally, not in writing, but through locked doors, through lost files, through the sudden deaths of 2 of my colleagues in the same quarter. The message was clear: run or disappear for good. I chose to run." A gasp broke from the gallery. A juror shifted, visibly disturbed. Raymond didn't flinch. He looked directly at the judge now. "I stayed gone because I believed the machine would win, that no one could stand against it. And I was right, until Jasmine Crockett walked into this courtroom." He turned toward her then, not dramatically but with clarity. "I saw what she was doing. I saw the evidence. I saw her pushed down, mocked, isolated, and I remembered." He paused, his voice catching just once before he steeled it again. "Justice doesn't vanish. It doesn't die. It just dims, waiting for someone willing to strike the match." He nodded slightly, eyes locked on Jasmine. "She reminded me what that match looks like." The room held its breath. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't move. But her eyes were full, not with tears, but something deeper, quiet gratitude wrapped in fire. Raymond turned back to the judge. "I've submitted the documents I kept hidden, contracts, meeting recordings, emails, and digital ledgers that prove Charles Lawson and Howard Gates conspired to funnel state money into private projects while manipulating the court system to silence opposition. I have the proof. I've had it all along. But it took someone braver than me to make it safe to use." The gallery broke its silence with a wave of hushed reactions. A reporter muttered into his recorder. A clerk scribbled furiously. Lawson had gone pale, his head lowered, his shoulders shaking, not in sorrow but in rage, in fear, in the realization that no one was coming to save him this time. Jasmine stood slowly as the judge asked if she wished to respond. She approached the bench without notes, without props, without anything but the truth burning in her chest. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and quiet, "the testimony we've just heard confirms what this investigation has uncovered layer by layer. That the defendant and his collaborators didn't just steal funds. They stole faith. They used the court like a weapon. They made the truth a threat." She turned to face the jury, then the gallery. "But what we've seen today also proves something greater. That even when justice is smothered, it doesn't die. It waits. It waits for someone to refuse silence. It waits for someone to come back." She looked again at Raymond. He nodded once, his face unreadable, but his hands folded with calm. "The documents Mr. Bell has submitted will be entered into evidence. They will be reviewed, investigated, and pursued. Not just to convict Charles Lawson," she said, turning her gaze toward the now defeated executive, "but to shine light on every dark corner he operated in. Every name, every deal, every blind eye." Her voice hardened slightly. "We are not here to punish one man. We are here to undo the lie he built." She returned to her table. The judge dismissed the hearing for the day, announcing that federal prosecutors would be reviewing the expanded evidence immediately. The bailiff called for order, but there was no restoring order to what had just happened. Not really. Something had shifted. Forever. Jasmine gathered her things slowly, the courtroom buzzing behind her in muted disbelief. She stepped outside the chamber doors, the late afternoon sun bleeding in through tall windows. In her hand, she carried the original folder, the one she had fought with, cried over, clung to when everything else told her to walk away. Her suit was slightly wrinkled, her feet ached, her throat dry, but her eyes were steady. A reporter called her name. She didn't turn. Another asked if she had anything to say to the public. She paused just for a breath, then looked straight ahead and answered, not with a speech, not with a smile, but with a single sentence that carried the weight of everything behind it. I didn't win because I had power. I won because I didn't quit. And then she walked forward, past cameras, past questions, past the ghosts of every truth they tried to bury, hand gripping the folder like a torch, gaze set on the fire still ahead. Because Jasmine Crockett knew, the fight for justice never truly ends, but it always begins with someone who refuses to stop. And just like that, Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the courtroom and into the pages of history, not merely as the prosecutor who took down Gates and Lawson, but as a woman who had challenged and dismantled a fortress built upon lies. As the heavy oak doors closed behind her, the muffled voices and flashing cameras blurred into a distant hum. She paused briefly, taking a slow breath that felt as though it had been held since the day the trial began. The weight of victory, hard-fought and almost unimaginable at times, settled softly on her shoulders. But Jasmine didn't smile. Not yet. Her journey wasn't merely one of triumph. It was forged from a storm of isolation, injustice, and betrayal that had nearly broken her. Yet through it all, she had remained standing, not because of power, not because of privilege, but simply because she had refused to surrender. She tightened her grip on the worn file in her hand, the documents she had clung to through the darkest days, now symbols of the truth she had fought so hard to expose. In the days following the trial, Jasmine's name became a synonym for justice restored. Media outlets clamored to tell her story, recounting every tense exchange, every courageous stand against intimidation, and every crushing revelation she had brought to light. Headlines splashed across newspapers and screens nationwide. The woman who broke the silence, a single prosecutor topples an empire, justice restored, Jasmine Crockett's unyielding battle. Interviews, book deals, and speaking requests flooded her inbox. Yet she accepted few, preferring instead to quietly navigate the aftermath of the seismic legal battle she had ignited. But public fascination could not be contained, and without seeking it, Jasmine found herself thrust into the spotlight, not as a figure of fleeting fame, but as a powerful reminder that justice, even when battered and bruised, was never truly defeated as long as someone dared to fight for it. Yet Jasmine's victory hadn't erased the scars left by the grueling fight against a system so deeply corrupted. She vividly remembered the whispers, the contemptuous glares from Gates, the condescending laughter from Lawson's defense team, all designed to break her. Those memories, once painful, now became her strength. They were reminders of why her story needed to be told, shared, and remembered. She knew firsthand the loneliness of standing alone against immense power, of speaking truths others desperately wanted buried. She had felt the suffocating pressure of injustice firsthand, had seen its chilling effect on lives destroyed without remorse. It wasn't enough to have won. She knew she had to ensure the battle she'd fought wasn't forgotten, that it became a beacon to others who might someday face their own seemingly impossible fight. Months later, Jasmine accepted an invitation to speak at a prominent law school, an event initially planned as a single lecture. As she stepped into the lecture hall for the first time, the room filled beyond capacity, students packed shoulder to shoulder, notebooks open, eyes fixed with anticipation. They had read the headlines, studied the transcripts, analyzed her tactics. Now they waited breathlessly to hear from the woman herself. Jasmine stepped onto the podium, standing quietly for a moment, her presence alone speaking volumes. She surveyed the faces of young students, eager, hopeful, determined, and for a brief second, she saw her younger self reflected back, someone who once believed the law would always stand tall on its own. She understood that these students, just like she once had, needed more than theory. They needed the raw truth of her experience, its harshness and beauty, despair and triumph. Justice is not a guarantee, Jasmine began softly, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent auditorium. It's an endless fight, one you must be willing to fight even when no one else believes victory is possible. Her words resonated deeply, each syllable settling heavily on the students. She told them of the intimidation, of the relentless attacks on her character, of the deliberate attempts to isolate and silence her. But then she spoke about the courage she found in the face of that isolation, the strength that emerged precisely because there had been no other choice but to continue fighting. The courtroom, she said clearly, is not just where laws are tested, it's where our courage, our resolve, and our very belief in justice itself are put to trial. After that first lecture, Jasmine quickly became a fixture at the university. Every Thursday she returned to speak, not merely as a lecturer, but as a storyteller whose very presence inspired hope. Students filled her classes eagerly, captivated by her stories not because they were thrilling, but because they were real. Jasmine never sugarcoated the cost of her fight. She revealed openly the toll it took, emotionally, mentally, physically, emphasizing repeatedly that justice was not achieved through comfortable means. But she also reminded them that it was precisely because justice was so fragile and easily compromised that fighting for it mattered so deeply. Over weeks, then months, Jasmine's influence expanded beyond the campus. Universities across the country invited her to speak, to ignite similar fires in future lawyers and advocates. Law professors referenced her trial in classrooms, not simply as an example of legal victory, but as evidence of the resilience required to confront systemic injustice. But despite the demand for her voice elsewhere, Jasmine remained deeply connected to the students she met each week, always choosing to return to the same lecture hall, the place where she first recognized the magnitude of her impact. Soon, Jasmine was no longer just a legal figure or public heroine. She had become an embodiment of what it meant to uphold justice in the face of impossible odds. Students admired not just her victories, but her integrity, her courage under pressure, her unyielding dignity, even when standing entirely alone. More than a few had entered law school driven by idealism, but now they were determined to emulate Jasmine's example, committed not only to defending the law, but also to challenging it when necessary, to confronting corruption head-on. Her lectures sparked fiery debates about ethics, responsibility, and the moral imperative to question authority, not out of defiance, but from the duty to ensure justice truly served all, not just those with power. Yet Jasmine remained humble, aware always that she had never sought fame nor power. Her victory wasn't the product of status or influence. Rather, it emerged from stubborn resilience, from a refusal to back down even when defeat seemed certain. She often concluded her lectures by reminding students, "You don't have to be powerful to change the world. You just have to refuse to let the world change you." Those words, quiet yet resonant, became a rallying cry among students who increasingly saw her not merely as a professor, but as a mentor, a guardian of principles they vowed to uphold themselves. One evening after class, a young woman approached Jasmine cautiously. "I want to fight for justice like you did," she said quietly, nervously holding out her hand. Jasmine shook it firmly, smiling gently for perhaps the first time. "Then prepare yourself not for praise but for struggle, for long nights alone, for battles that will feel unwinnable. And know this," Jasmine paused, looking intently into the student's eyes, "the greatest victories are not found in verdicts or headlines, but in the quiet moments you choose to stand firm when every voice around you tells you to stop." The student nodded slowly, visibly strengthened, the torch of Jasmine's fight clearly passing between them. As the lecture hall emptied, Jasmine stood alone for a moment, quietly gathering her belongings. Her fingers traced the edges of the very same file she'd clung to during the trial. The papers inside, once heavy with evidence, now seemed weightless in comparison to the truths she had discovered within herself. She stepped toward the doorway, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty room, a place that had become both refuge and battleground, sanctuary and stage. As she crossed the threshold back into the world, she did so with no illusions about what lay ahead. More battles, more resistance, more uncertainty, but also with unshakable clarity. Jasmine Crockett had not triumphed because she was powerful. She had triumphed precisely because she wasn't, because she had faced injustice armed not with influence, but with resilience, because she understood that the fight for justice was never ending, that every generation must choose to carry it forward. Stepping into the cool night air, Jasmine drew a deep breath, finally allowing herself to smile. Not in victory, but in quiet pride, recognizing fully, perhaps for the first time, the power of never giving up. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.